forces of evolution have been shaping plants for thousands or millions of years before agriculture. These evolutionary forces acted to maximize individual plant fitness. That is, the individual plant's ability to grow, survive, and reproduce itself. However, farmers are not concerned about individual plant reproductive success. They care about the reproductive success of the whole plant community. When farmers grow a crop, unless it's something like an intercrop, these crops are generally of the same species and the same variety, but evolutionarily, they have been designed to be competitors. We want them to be friends, to collaborate and maximize yields together, but there are strong evolutionary forces that mitigate this cooperation. Evolution has shaped plant behavior in really, really good ways. Don't get me wrong. Things like C4 photosynthesis, for example, right? Evolution has done things that we could never do as humans in terms of improving plant productivity or crop productivity. So many crop management decisions are made to essentially improve plant cooperation, thereby improve crop performance, that is plant community performance, at the expense of individual plant performance. Crop height is a great example about how evolution occurring in natural ecosystems can run counter to what we want to see happening in our managed temperate cropping systems. So in nature, taller plants are more successful because they shade their neighbors, they make their neighbors less competitive, and they capture more light. And so in a natural ecosystem, the optimal plant height is to be a little bit taller than your neighbor. And so, for example, in many of small grain cereals, things like oats, wheats, barley, their pre-crop ancestors, the more successful of them would be taller. But in managed systems, agricultural systems, remember, we don't care about individual plant performance. We care about the community performance. And so a plant that grows very, very tall might shade its neighbor, but we care about that neighbor too, and we don't want it to be overly shaded by a tall neighbor. So on average, taller crops do not capture more light. Remember, going back to that yield equation, they're more susceptible to lodging. We talked about that in the first lecture. And they allocate more carbon to the stem than to the grain. Remember that law of conservation of matter. If carbon is fixed via photosynthesis and it goes to the stem, well, it can't go to the grain where it contributes to yield. And so taller plants are good in natural ecosystems, but we don't really want very tall plants in our managed systems. We want to maximize community performance. So there's a number of different ways farmers can manage the height of their crop canopy. Number one would be variety selection. So choosing if they want a dwarf or semi-dwarf variety of wheat or oats. This would be different if they're growing something like oats for the straw, then they'd want a taller variety. But for grain, they would want a shorter variety. Farmers can also use what's called plant growth regulators. And these are chemicals which are antagonists to plant hormones that are responsible for stem elongation. So, for example, the gibberellic acid is a type of hormone that produces lengthens the internodes in like wheat or oats. And certain plant growth regulators will stop gibberellic acid from doing that. So these plant growth regulators essentially shorten the internodes on a cereal stem, thereby reducing plant height. So aside from crop height, we can also think about leaf area. So in natural ecosystems, the leafier the plant is, the better it can shade neighbors. Again, it can minimize competition with its neighbors by shading them. It can hedge against insect and herbivore defoliation. So, you'll produce more leaves than you might need because, well, you don't know if there's going to be an elephant that roams by or whatever, an insect that munches on one of them. So you have kind of extra leaves. There's a benefit to having a couple extra leaves. If you're a grass, you're going to have lots of tillers because that's, in natural ecosystems, a good hedge for survival. You'll take advantage of very good years by having lots of tillers. But in managed systems, leafier plants aren't necessarily beneficial, right? If you have plants that have lots of leaves, well, they might not intercept more radiation. Remember that alpha from the yield equation. If you have lots and lots of leaves, you're just going to end up shading other leaves. And so you're not actually increasing the interception of PAR. You're just shading leaves that would have otherwise intercepted that PAR. And so you're wasting carbohydrates and nutrients that could otherwise go to the grain or to the roots or to have some other productive function. They're being overinvested in leaves. So like the harvest index that we discussed in a previous video, leaf area index is really a fundamental measurement to assess temperate cropping systems. So again, this is an agronomic measurement because we're looking at something on a per land area basis. And what leaf area does is it says, okay, we as farmers do not care so much about individual plant leaf area, how big the leaves are on an individual plant. We care about total leaf area at a crop level. So leaf area index is when you take a random sample of a square meter in a field, and then you take all the leaves from all the plants in that square meter and you measure that leaf area. And the leaf area index is again a ratio of the total area of the leaves per area of ground. So let me just give an example to see how that's calculated. Okay, so let's just work through an example to better understand how to calculate leaf area index and what it means. So step one would be to measure out a known area. So, 3 meters squared would be let's say a normal kind of area to take this measurement on. So you'd measure out 3 square meters. Then you would hand harvest all the plants in that area, every single one. You would take it back to the lab, and then you would measure the leaf area of every single plant. So what you would do is cut off the leaves. In this case, this is corn plants. You would cut off each corn plant and run it through. You can see on the lower left, this is called a leaf area meter. It's basically a conveyor belt. And long story short, you run an individual leaf through that conveyor belt, and it'll spit out how many square centimeters that leaf is. So you add up all the leaf area from every single plant that was harvested, and you just divide one by the other. Okay, so depending on what the actual measured leaf area is, your leaf area index is going to be different numbers. So there's a worked example there. So from a crop management perspective, what's important to note is that canopy interception, again, part of that yield equation we talked about earlier, the proportion of PAR intercepted by the canopy achieves a near maximum at a particular LAI. So in the case of soybeans, this is data from soybeans, radiation interception is almost maximized, 95% at an LAI of 3. And so to achieve 100% radiation interception, you would need to almost double leaf area from 3 to 6. And generally, from a cost-benefit analysis, that investment is not worth it, right? It's better for that crop to not invest in leaf area going from 3 to 6, but to take those carbohydrates and nutrients and invest that in the grain. So from a crop management perspective, there is a near optimal LAI, an LAI where that farmer is achieving almost 100% solar radiation interception, and they're not overinvesting, that crop is not overinvesting in leaves at the expense of grain. So just to note here that in soybean, a leaf area index of 3 is sufficient to maximize solar radiation interception, achieve near 100%. But this is going to differ from crop to crop. So corn or wheat will have solar radiation interception reach 100% at a different LAI, and that has to do with things like the shape of the leaves and the structure of the canopy. But you don't have to memorize any of these specific numbers, and you won't ever have to calculate LAI. Two of the main ways farmers manipulate leaf area index in their crop production systems is by adjusting row spacings and seeding rates. The idea is to achieve near maximum canopy interception, so achieve that optimum LAI that gets you almost 100% interception as early as possible in the season. Okay, that's very important for yields. And you manipulate seeding rate and row spacing to do that. However, if you go to too narrow of a row spacing, if you increase seeding rate too high, then you're going to intensify plant-to-plant competition. Essentially, you're going to have very high what's called density stress or crowding stress, and those crops just won't yield. They're just going to kind of grow vegetatively, but they're not going to actually produce any grain. So it's this careful balance that farmers are managing between, adjusting row spacing and seeding rate to manage that plant-to-plant competition and maximize that interception of radiation as early in the season as possible. So what you see here is another soybean example here from Ohio State, where you see the impact of different row spacings and different seeding rates on canopy. You can see canopy structure and then final yield. The last management practice that I'll talk about that relates to increasing cooperation among crop plants is this idea of even emergence and management practices that increase the evenness of emergence. And by that I mean, that all these seeds are germinating and emerging out of the ground at the same time, within 24 hours of each other. And so many agronomists, high yield contest winners, etc., harp on the importance of even emergence. And maybe you don't realize why is that important for temperate crop production. So let's think this through in terms of improving crop cooperation. So a crop stand that has uneven emergence is going to have a row of corn. Some of those plants are going to emerge, let's say, on day 1. We'll call it day 1. Some will emerge on day 2. Some will emerge on day 3, day 4, day 5, and day 6. And so in a field, in a stand of plants, in a crop, you'll have some plants that emerge day 1, some plants that emerge, all the way as far as day 6 or later. Okay, so you have differences in the timing of emergence. And that means you're going to promote differences in how big those crops are once they start competing with each other, once they grow tall enough and large enough that they're going to start interacting with their neighbors. So this pattern of uneven emergence creates what we call, as scientists, dominated and dominant plants, with those early emerging plants being dominant and those later emerging plants being dominated, right? They're being dominated and are going to be shaded and outcompeted for resources. So the dominant plants are going to yield a little bit more, right? Because they're taller than their neighbors. They're gonna outgrow them, outcompete them. And the dominated plants are going to yield a lot less, right? Because they're shaded and they don't have good access to the nutrients they need. And so they won't yield very much, if at all. And so we have these dominant and dominated plants. Now, the reason why uneven emergence almost always reduces yield is that on a per area basis, the increase in yield from those dominant plants, the slight increase in yield that those dominant plants have because they're not competing for resources, does not make up for the massive decrease in yield from those dominated plants. Okay, so it just does not work out for the farmer who's trying to maximize yield per area because those dominant plants do not compensate for the yield reduction experienced by those dominated plants.